This first experience is a valuable reminder to be careful to watch your step and where you are going. On July 31st, 1986, a group of 12 graduate students from the University of Miami were on a field trip in Costa Rica. One of them was a 24-year-old student from Malaysia, studying for his doctorate in biology at the same institution. During the hike, this student made his way ahead of the group and came across a series of caves in a steep rock face. He entered the cave, and in order to see what was inside, he activated his flashlight. Although the result was not foreseeable, this decision was the worst one that he could have made. A flurry of activity ignited inside the cave that could not have been expected when the student turned on his light. Before he knew what was happening, the student was being bombarded from all directions by an inscrutable and seemingly invisible force. As he dashed outside into the light, the chain of events that had unfolded immediately became clear to the other members of his group. Without knowing it, he had stumbled upon and surprised a colony of Africanized honeybees that had made their hive inside this remote cavity. Africanized honeybees, better known as killer bees, were accidentally released from Brazil in 1957 and quickly became an invasive species in South America, Central America, and the southern United States. Unlike the more docile Western honeybee, Africanized honeybees are extremely aggressive, deploying 10 times as many guard bees to attack perceived predators, and can chase those same predators for up to a mile from their nest. According to those present, the bees formed a cloud around the student's head as he scrambled for shelter in a crevice between two rocks. Instead, the bees followed him into the opening and down into the rock, and continued to sting him from all sides. In the confined space, he was unable to escape. He was now trapped in a claustrophobe's nightmare with an even larger swarm of bees waiting for him in the event he emerged from his cover. Each sting would feel like a pinprick, then itch and swell up painfully at the sight, and the stingers left in the victim's body would inject copious amounts of venom into his bloodstream. Other symptoms would set in and quickly become severe. These symptoms included breathing difficulties, swelling in the tongue and throat, dizziness, and diarrhea. All of this, and undoubtedly much more, took place in the first few minutes of the attack. For over an hour, the student remained unreachable through the swarm of killer bees, and it was all that his classmates could do to avoid falling victim to their fury themselves. Another several hours passed before the bees had calmed down enough for Costa Rican soldiers to recover his body from the crevice into which he had crawled for shelter. By this time, the student was long dead, probably succumbing within the first hour. Generally speaking, an adult human can withstand a few hundred bee stings before succumbing to anaphylaxis or toxic shock. In the end, the student suffered an estimated total of over 8,000 stings over the course of 3 hours. Over 1,000 other victims have died at the hands of killer bees in the 6 decades since their accidental release. By the time you hear about this incident, it's hard to imagine having a worse day. It was 9 p.m. on the night of July 5th, 2021, and a mother and her 15-year-old daughter were driving down the North Freeway of Interstate 45 in Houston, Texas. The teenager and her mother were reportedly in a heated argument about a subject hitherto unknown. The argument had been going on for some time. the distressed teenager decided to jump out of the moving car on a freeway where vehicles travel at speeds of up to 65 miles per hour, or 104 kilometers per hour. The surfaces, speeds, and forces involved would simultaneously inflict gruesome injuries on an unprotected person, and likely wounds would have included road rash along with a concussion and fractures of various kinds. What made matters worse was that she had hopped out of the car as another car was approaching behind the one driven by her mother. Given the time of day at which the incident occurred, it was almost dark on the freeway, and most drivers would not be expecting a person to jump out of the car ahead of them. Usually, such freak events are confined to movies and television. The car following swerved and missed the teenager, but she was immediately struck head-on by a second vehicle close behind the first. Whether through fear, shock, or callousness, the driver of the second car fled the location of the accident. The bloody scene of the teenager's death reportedly stretched for some distance down the freeway from where the victim was struck, and to this day, the driver of the offending vehicle has not been identified or caught. In the midst of such a traumatizing and humiliating incident, the victim's family was unable to fully cover the costs of her funeral. This next story also begins in Houston, but it doesn't end there. On May 11th, 2023, a 63-year-old manager of an Arby's restaurant in Houston, Texas, was on temporary reassignment managing another Arby's location in the nearby town of New Iberia, Louisiana. She arrived in the early morning to begin her duties, and by all accounts, she was alone in the restaurant. Other employees were due to arrive at the restaurant at 10 o'clock a.m., and they did so. However, when they entered the back of the restaurant, they found something that they were not expecting. Their manager was nowhere to be found and could not be reached by phone. The employees showing up for the morning shift left, and it wasn't until 6 p.m. that day that another employee showed up to investigate. Inside the walk-in freezer, they discovered the dead body of their temporary manager, as well as the disturbing scene that surrounded her corpse. Tragically, the employee who found her was her own son, who worked at the location where she had been filling in as manager, and who was disabled and dependent on her for care. It was not difficult for investigators and the family attorney to discover the gist of how she had died. When she was unable to extricate herself from the freezer, she was left in a room where the temperature fell as low as -20 degrees Fahrenheit. To varying degrees, the inside of the freezer door was covered with blood, and the manager's body was found on the floor in the fetal position. After being trapped for up to 5 hours in the freezer, she had been loosely frozen to the floor by her own blood. The blood itself was found to be from her mangled hands, which she had beaten raw against the locked door of the freezer in the process of trying to escape. Several investigators working on the case took turns standing in the room afterward with the freezer at its lowest temperature, and wearing no protective clothing in order to understand what the frigid environment had felt like in her final hours. One of those involved said that after a short time standing in the room, it felt like their blood was freezing. Their clothes went stiff, and it was difficult to move. After only a few minutes, each pounded on the door to be let out by another investigator. The family of the deceased manager has since filed a lawsuit against the companies involved in the operation of that particular restaurant.